Okay, so Apollo was in many ways, the epitome of the American space effort. Is what most people think of as the sine qua non, the landing on the moon and subsequent to it. Its advantage was that it had a very well-defined endpoint, which you all know, and you can quote from the Kennedy speech. Its disadvantage was that it had a very well-defined endpoint, and there was not a clear direction nor a clear financial commitment as to where to go afterwards. A number of people had been floating ideas, both from inside NASA and from the scientific community, but it was very much a big question mark about where do we go next. And so today we're going to hear from John Talco on this question of the decision to build the space shuttle and sort of a bookend of the space shuttle program. John, welcome back.
Thank you. Okay, well, this is one of my favorite pictures, actually. It's done by Robert McCall, who was probably one of the top space artists. It's obviously the STS-1 launch, but he does kind of a good job of showing some of the workers. That's Gene Kranz, by the way. Somebody said that's a Death Star. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's at the Epcot Center, at the American Pavilion at Epcot. So the Space Shuttle program actually has its roots in the time frame of 1968 and 69 with NASA planning studies that were led by George Miller. And for just to refresh, George Miller was brought in 1963 as the person in charge of the Office of Manned Spaceflight. So by the time that Apollo is getting ready to fly, he's already sort of focused on what's the next system. In many ways, we're still executing what was known as the von Braun paradigm, which Wernher von Braun laid out 6 steps of space exploration: an Earth orbiting satellite, humans in Earth orbit, a space shuttle, a space station. The 5th of those was landing a man on the moon. The 6th of those is landing a man on Mars. That was defined in the 40s and 50s by von Braun. And largely what happened with Apollo is we skipped from steps 1 and 2 to step 5 without executing 3 and 4. And for the better part of the last 40 years, between the Space Shuttle program and the International Space Station, we've effectively been executing steps 3 and 4 out of sequence. And that sort of set the stage for sort of this difference between the first 10 years of human spaceflight focused on getting to the moon and exploring the moon, and then the next 40 years with sort of this perception of being stuck in low Earth orbit. Miller is considered to be the father of the space shuttle. This is probably the first speech at actually the British Interplanetary Society in August of '68, where he coins the term space shuttle. It's interesting that the first contracts, which were the study contracts for what was called Phase A of the space shuttle planning, started in the fall of '68 with an RFP, and then 4 contractors were selected in February of '69, and a space shuttle task group was established. The work for the space shuttle was largely based on the prior work that both NASA, NACA, and the Air Force conducted on lifting bodies and the X-15 rocket plane. Max Faget was also a key player. And by the way, the people that did the space shuttle were the same people that did Apollo. There were largely people from the original Space Task Group from Langley, like Max Faget, or people brought into the agency like George Miller, but it was not a whole new cast of characters. It was the top engineers from Apollo that were now responsible for executing the space shuttle. This was a meeting that he called on April 1 of 1969. Now keep in mind, we had only flown 3 of the Apollo missions. We had only made 1 flight of the lunar module. This was before Apollo 10. Now some people thought this was a prank or an April Fool's joke, that he called everyone to the 3rd floor of a building that at the Manned Spacecraft Center. People didn't even know that it had a 3rd floor. And he basically told this assembled group of about 20 engineers, we're going to build the next American spacecraft, and it's going to launch like a spacecraft, and it's going to land like a plane. And this was effectively the approach that Faget was advocating back in '69, which was a fixed wing, not a delta body, a fixed wing, straight wing shuttle concept. And largely at that time, the concept was you would actually have two manned spacecraft. You would have a booster that would execute the first phase of the mission that would also be manned and would also land, return to the launch site and land on a runway. So in the early phase of the program, that was the concept. Here are some of the other early shuttle concepts in terms of defining what the shuttle might look like at that time. Richard Nixon was elected 37th President of the United States in November of 1968. People came to him very early on and basically said, if you want to continue to get to the moon as planned for Apollo, don't change the NASA leadership. And the NASA leader at this time, right in October of '68, James Webb went to the White House in a meeting with Lyndon Johnson. He basically offered to resign. This is not the first time he offered to resign, by the way. He had done that a couple of times, but this time Johnson actually takes him up on it, and he walks him down to the press office of the White House and forces his hand. Effectively, they call an impromptu press conference, and James Webb resigns that day. And the deputy administrator, Tom Paine had been brought into the agency in January of '68 to replace Bob Siemens as the deputy. Paine was made the acting administrator in October of '68, and Nixon decides to retain him and make him effectively the third administrator of NASA. So some other changes. In June of '69, Nixon cancels the Air Force Manned Orbiting Laboratory program. It's interesting, during Apollo 11, if you look at the transcripts, if you look at all the time that's spent on the lunar surface by the crews, there's no reference to John F. Kennedy. The carrier, John F. Kennedy, had just been commissioned by the U.S. Navy the prior year, and NASA had made a request to the Nixon administration that the Kennedy be the recovery vessel for Apollo 11. That was actually shut down. It ended up being the Hornet. However, Nixon does realize the kind of public relations opportunity he has with the successful Apollo 11, and basically sets up a world tour that starts with being on the recovery ship, the USS Hornet, in the Pacific when Apollo 11 is recovered. And then he goes off for 2+ weeks around the world to something like 20 countries on sort of a goodwill tour that is based upon the successful Apollo 11. However, Apollo 20 is canceled the following year in January 1970. Now that mission has a Saturn V that is then allocated to the Skylab program. One thing that kind of hits close to home here in Cambridge is the closing of the NASA Electronics Research Center. This was opened under the Kennedy administration and closed under the Nixon administration in June of 1970. It's the only NASA center ever to close. It's right now the John Volpe U.S. National Transportation Center in Cambridge, right near Kendall Square. And then Apollos 18 and 19 were canceled in September of 1970. So this is in an era where NASA's budget is declining pretty significantly. Tom Paine is actually a great choice as NASA administrator. He has a PhD from Stanford. He worked for 20 years at General Electric. Larry, did you?
John, I just wanted you to comment a little bit further on the cancellations of Apollos 20, 19, and 18, because I thought I understood it, and then it was explained to me by Senator Schmidt, but at least that was not what he had heard from President Nixon.
Well, I'll give you kind of my view. I mean, there are different views. I think what really happened is, if you look at the timing, Apollo 13 took place in April of 1970, and at a time frame when NASA is sort of looking at what its goals should be. I think there were some very senior, well-respected managers of NASA, like Bob Gilruth, that started to get pretty concerned that by keeping, at that point, it would be another, I guess, 6 missions that there was risk that they would actually have a catastrophic failure on one of those flights. That after achieving the success of Apollo, executing the Kennedy goal, that really the remaining missions after 13, which ended up being 4 flights, were enough to accomplish the scientific objectives. So I actually think the decision was sort of a mutual decision between OMB and the Nixon White House looking for budget savings, and some of the key and most influential people at NASA, particularly people like Bob Gilruth, getting concerned about the risks associated with Apollo after the Apollo 13 accident.
Right, right. As Senator Schmidt said that he was told, look, we have a success. This is by, whether it was by the President Nixon or somebody in the White House. We have such a clear success beginning with Apollo 11. Mm-hmm. Why risk spoiling it? We
Right.
don't have anything to gain.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think you read, I hope you read the short piece that was assigned, which was basically a letter that was written by James Fletcher, who I'll introduce in a second here, to Cap Weinberger, who was at that time the head of the OMB. And that letter is dated, I think, September of 1971. And that basically is a letter defending Apollo 16 and 17 from cancellation. So there were active efforts even the following year. You know, if you think about the timing, this is roughly 6 months before Apollo 16 flies. That memo is you know, a very strong defense by the NASA administrator to the head of the Office of Management and Budget, basically saying we should keep the plan to fly 16 and 17. So there was a serious threat that 16 and 17 would also be canceled at that time. Tom Paine has actually only served for about 1.5 years as NASA administrator, but I think is one of the most sort of visionary NASA administrators that we've had. He had a strong passion for spaceflight and actually ended up pioneering the Space Frontier Commission on Space. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan to that study in 1986, and it's actually I think one of the better. There's been a whole series of these reports on commissions that were set up to sort of determine our future in space. This is one of about 6 or 7, but maybe one of the best. So in 1969, Nixon actually forms a space task group. This is not to be confused with the Langley Space Task Group, to basically make recommendations to the White House by September 1, 1969, of what our future plans should be in space. It's chaired by Vice President Spiro Agnew in his role as the chairman of the National Aeronautics and Space Council. And one of the earlier lectures I told you about how that was formulated and kind of the role that Johnson had in formulating it. Various presidents have used it on and off through the years. Nixon used it as sort of a thing for Agnew to do. But the team is a pretty good team. It consists of Spiro Agnew, Tom Paine, Bob Seamans. Seamans is now, after sort of taking a year hiatus at MIT in 1968, he's appointed by Richard Nixon as the Air Force Secretary in the spring of 1969. Presidential Science Advisor Lee DuBridge, and probably one of the most prominent people, Glenn Seaborg, who at that time was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, Spiro Agnew gets excited about space. He's actually shown in this picture. This is the Apollo 11 launch. This is Lyndon Johnson, who's now been out of the White House about 6 months, Lady Bird Johnson. That's Spiro Agnew. I think the important thing about this, though, on live television on CBS, and I actually remember watching it, Agnew basically declares that the next goal in space should be landing humans on Mars by the end of the century. You know, one of the great things about the Nixon administration, and we will probably never see this again, is the White House taping system. By this point, it's gotten really quite good in terms of thousands of hours of conversations that are recorded, not just in the Oval Office, but in the Cabinet Room, in Nixon's hideaway in the Executive Office Building, on Air Force One. There's a whole variety of taping systems. After Watergate, that'll never happen again, but This is a conversation with John Ehrlichman, who becomes famous in the Watergate affair, forced to resign, I think indicted, and I think convicted. But at this time, he's the president's chief domestic advisor. This is to Agnew. Basically, there is no money for a Mars trip. The president has already decided that, so that the president does not want such a trip, and the Space Advisory Committee uses a different name, recommendations. Now Nixon, I can't remember if this is actually on tape or in the margin of a memo, but Nixon writes back or says, "Good, that's just the way to handle him," meaning Agnew. Use that technique on him anytime. Is Agnew insubordinate? And the senior White House staff basically concludes that Agnew was not a Nixon team player, based largely on kind of going off the reservation on the on NASA's future. However, the NASA administrator, Tom Paine, kind of misreads this enthusiasm that Agnew has and assumes that Agnew has real clout within the White House. He really doesn't. Often vice presidents do not have a lot of political clout, but I would say the relationship with Nixon and Agnew was particularly demonstrative of that. And he assumes that there's actually serious White House interest in the future of NASA. This is an interesting memo that's written by Bob Seamans as Secretary of the Air Force to Agnew and just after the Apollo 11 landing. And I think what's significant is that actually, now he's sort of writing this as, 8 years as the Deputy Administrator of NASA, only in the Air Force job a few months, but is sort of reflecting on the priorities that should be undertaken at NASA, including putting increased emphasis on aeronautics, conducting the Apollo Applications Program, which becomes Skylab, but recommending that we embark on a space transportation system. And this is sort of the first instantiation of the Department of Defense's interest in the Space Shuttle program. And you'll see from the discussion today that becomes pivotal not only for selling the program to Congress, but also the design traits that get introduced into the Space Shuttle as a result of that. The Space Task Group actually submits its report to the President on September 15th, and it outlines 3 levels of effort for the post-Apollo space program. And by the way, at this point, the NASA budget is already down to about $3.5 to $4 billion in this time frame. So there's 3 options. One is an option to spend $8 to $10 billion a year, so almost 2 to 2.5 times the current budget, which would result in a goal of landing humans on Mars by as early as 1983. By the way, this is the first report. This isn't the cover. This is just a comic from a newspaper. But the second recommendation is a $6 billion option, which basically says we can get to Mars landing by 1990. And then an in-between option of $7.5 billion, which would put the Mars landing in 1986. So these are actually, if you just look at it, 83, 86, 90, that's only a 7-year window, and it's basically giving 3 options. Now they expect to hear back from the White House some type of response, and the White House is completely silent. There is no response at all from the White House. It's almost like this report goes to a dead-end mailbox, and it's not even seriously considered. Now, Miller continues his campaign for a reusable space shuttle. NASA holds a symposium in October of '69, and this is where sort of some of the key requirements start to get defined, and particularly important is the cost per pound to low Earth orbit. The Saturn V is considered to be about $1,000 per pound, and the projection is that the shuttle will be able to achieve somewhere between $20 a pound and $50 a pound. So a factor of 50 or 20 from what it is with the Saturn V. They identify some of the key problems: development of an engine that will provide sufficient specific impulse, the reentry system and the checkout and ground control equipment. One of the challenges to justify effectively a space transportation system is some projection of what the actual demand will be. So this forecast becomes one of the bases for actually selling the space shuttle program. So this is a 10-year forecast from 1975 to 1985, but as you'll see, the annual numbers go from about launches of about 16 to 17, and then it jumps in 1978 to 60 launches a year on the space shuttle system for pretty much a decade. And notice what drives this. I mean, basically a space station program, which could be Skylab. It's not clear what that is. But then a space base with 50 men on orbit, rotating the crew each quarter, putting unmanned planetary flights, unmanned satellites, and then a very aggressive lunar program with a 6-man orbital station and a 6-man base. Now, it's very interesting to see that this forecast of roughly 60 launches a year actually becomes the basis for which the shuttle program is based on. And you'll see that in several different incarnations. Sometimes it goes up slightly, but largely for the next 3 years, while the shuttle program is basically being sold to the White House and to Congress, the basis for the shuttle is to fly 60 missions a year and about 500 flights over a roughly 10-year period. So a lot of NASA management changes take place in late '69.
How many flights did it actually average per year?
Well, it depends on how you count that. So it flew 135 flights, effectively over 30 years. So if you just divide that out, it's 4. The most per year, I think, was 8, and several, due to the issues with the recovery from both Challenger and Columbia, there were down periods for about 2.5 years where no flights took place. But kind of toward the end of the program, they were flying about 4 to 5 missions a year, but the maximum rate that was hit was 8 per year.
So were they effectively amortizing the cost of the space shuttle over that number of flights?
I'll show you. Good point. I'll show you the report that became the pivotal report used to sell the shuttle program, and it was done by a Princeton research group called Mathematica. And basically it was econometrics. They took a bunch of assumptions, and I maintain that they actually started to get into sort of recommending what technical option NASA should pick for the launch vehicle, because sort of the interaction between Mathematica and NASA is what led to the decision to go with the solid rocket booster configuration, but we'll get into that. So this is the lineup at one of the hearings for the Apollo 1 spacecraft fire. Siemens is gone, Webb is gone. This is George Miller, and this is George Low. After Tom Paine is made the NASA administrator, he appoints George Low as his deputy. Shortly thereafter, Miller resigns and leaves NASA. Dale Myers replaces Miller as associate head of manned spaceflight. The Air Force reassigns General Sam Phillips, who's a pivotal player in Apollo, back to the Air Force. Rocco Petrone becomes the Apollo program office manager, and Jim McDivitt, who was one of the Group 2 astronauts who flew Apollo 9, becomes the Apollo program manager down at the Manned Spacecraft Center. So pretty much a whole new team is running NASA in late '69. So Nixon, after receiving that report in September, for about 6 months, the White House is quiet, and then this document is actually officially released by the White House, outlining 6 objectives for the National Space Program policy in March of 1970. Continued exploration of the moon, exploration of the planets and the universe, but substantial reductions in the cost of space operations, extension of man's ability to work and live in space, focus on practical applications, and greater international cooperation. Those 4 are basically used to justify the shuttle mission. But I think this quote is particularly relevant. Space expenditures must take their proper place within a rigorous system of national priorities. What we do in space from here on must be must become a regular part of our national life and must therefore be planned in conjunction with all the other undertakings which are important to us. In other words, saying that NASA is no longer going to get the sort of super priority that it had in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and that future expenditures in NASA will have to be justified relative to other national expenditures. So there's sort of two ways to see that. One is the actual budget in dollars, and this is the NASA budget in constant 2008 dollars. So it peaked at about 27 billion in sort of recent period dollars. That I think the actual number was about 6 billion in 1965. This is sort of like a kind of response to a dynamic surge. It's recovering to some mean. The mean is around 15 to 18 billion dollars a year, which is what the NASA budget has been for the last decade. But it actually dropped in this time frame under Nixon. Nixon effectively, his first budget is the 1970 budget, and then through the 1975 budget. So that's effectively, now the decline started under Johnson, but continues under Nixon. The other way to look at it is percent of the U.S. federal budget, and it actually peaks at 4%. By the way, today I think our national federal budget is on the order of 2.7 billion, so 4% trillion. Thank you. Billion here, billion there, pretty soon you have real money. That was a quote by the famous quote by Everett Dirksen in the Senate minority leader. It's even more true today. So if we were at 4% of the federal budget at 2.7 trillion, we'd be looking at a $100 billion budget for NASA today, which is about 5 times more than it actually is. So NASA succumbs to the OMB.
Would you comment on the atmosphere which made Congress happy to support a very expensive program during the initial period in which the competition with the Russians was so acute, and a decade later to see it drop? We were still the Cold War was still very much in evidence.
Right. Well, I think the Apollo 11 landing really kind of represented the completion of the Kennedy objective in space for a lot of people. And although NASA was on a high, sort of thinking it could do just about anything, that image did not transcend to the public and their representatives in Congress. So there were strong space advocates in the Congress. Many key players, like people like Olin Teague, for example, continued to champion space from his position as the chair of the House Science Committee. But for the most part, the administration and the Congress reflected the sort of spirit of the American people, and it was, I think the fact that we had achieved Apollo did not transcend into sort of more lofty immediate goals in space. This is also coming in an era where there was a big surge in federal spending for both the Vietnam War and the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson's social programs, so we were kind of facing with budget issues. And as you go into the 1970s, we also faced some major issues like oil shocks that started to impact in the 1973 timeframe, for example. And the economy through that period was pretty weak. And I maintain, by the way, that one of the real reasons we were able to do Apollo was the strength of the U.S. economy coming out of World War II in the 50s and 60s, created significant amount of effectively national disposable income to be able to tackle a program as ambitious as Apollo was. Shortly after the cancellation of Apollo 18 and 19, Tom Paine resigns. George Low becomes the administrator, and he writes a memo to George Shultz, who is at that point the OMB director. By the way, Shultz would go on to become the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. He's actually an MIT grad, by the way. He's an MIT economist.
Left us for Stanford.
Yeah, he's more known as a Stanford guy. But George Lowe's memo basically says the key element in our program is the space shuttle. It supports 4 of the president's 6 objectives. They're deferring the decision to do a space station. They're basically claiming savings from the cancellation of the last 2 Apollo flights. You read in that memo that the cost of those flights is very, very low. I mean, that memo, I think, says the cost of the last 2 missions, he's defending 16 and 17, but it's only about 120 million of savings. And this basically is the start of sort of NASA saying, okay, we're canceling Apollo 18 and 19, but the space shuttle is going to be the main center of debate, effectively, between the NASA headquarters folks and OMB over the course of pretty much the next 18 months. So it's really between September 70 and January of 72 that this decision gets sorted out. This is where the Department of Defense comes in, and they actually give NASA a requirement. And these requirements, so 3 of the requirements actually match very nicely to what NASA is already planning on doing, supporting this kind of cargo, 45,000 pounds, accommodating a crew of up to 10 persons for up to 7 days, and flying up to 50 missions a year. That's already in the planning. The piece that is not in the planning is the cross-range requirement to be able to maneuver over 1,200 statute miles during a single orbit of the Earth. So the idea is that you launch, get on orbit, deploy a satellite, or take a photo, let's say, and quickly come back, deorbit, and land on the next landing opportunity at the launch site, which is now in 90 minutes of Earth rotation moved 1,265 statute miles. So it's all predicated on what are the reentry trajectories and heat loads on the shuttle to effectively implement that cross-range capability that was never used even once in the shuttle program, never demonstrated. But what it creates is a significant trade on the shuttle heating rates during reentry. So effectively, the Max Faget design is able to accommodate a much higher L over D of 1.7, and it sort of spreads the entry heating rate over a much longer entry time. I'm sorry, the straight wing is 0.5. The delta wing orbiter is an L over D of 1.7. So this curve is what became the shuttle. This curve is the Max Faget concept. So the Max Faget concept would not be able to achieve the cross range that the Department of Defense required. The delta wing orbiter with the higher L over D can achieve that cross range performance, and effectively becomes the choice for the program. This largely leads to the decision that the shuttle can be done with aluminum as its primary structure as opposed to titanium. This configuration probably would have required titanium. This configuration largely is based on an aluminum structure. Something like 30% of the gross weight of the space shuttle orbiter is aluminum. So this is the requirement that NASA publishes as the spec in June of 1970. I'm not going to discuss every point, but you'll see the cross range. They actually asked the contractors to look at 2 alternatives. One is to have effectively minimal cross range, which is the NASA requirement. The other is to have this 1,200 nautical mile cross range, which the Air Force requires. Most of these other requirements are actually met, although one of the ones that is in the program for some time is the ability to do a go-around landing in the case of a missed approach. And so the early configurations of the shuttle have jet engines where the OMS maneuvering pods are. with the idea that if you miss the runway on your first attempt, you could actually use those jet engines to circle and do a second landing attempt. Those are eventually discarded due to complexity and cost and weight.
John, further on the DoD imposed requirements. The DoD was interested primarily in polar orbit,
Right.
so that you could in fact view every point on the Earth.
Correct.
And that led to the capability for launching from Vandenberg Air Force Base on,
Yep.
on the West Coast,
Right.
having to do with not launching over populated areas, over land, and so on. But if you launch from the Pacific Coast and want to return to launch site or one orbit, you've got nothing but the Pacific Ocean under you.
Right.
And that there again, to be able to reach not only land but friendly land,
Mm-hmm.
because you really didn't want to land in Kamchatka, led to this decision.
Right.
Make it to Australia.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The polar launch capability out of Vandenberg, which was actually, again, never executed, but the plan was to fly a mission as early as, I think, June of '86. So maybe it was the second or third mission after Challenger was going to be out of SLC 6 or Slick 6, they call it, out at Vandenberg. So Enterprise was out there. There's some classic shots of the Enterprise stacked on the SLC to sort of test the launch site, the launch facilities, but that was actually canceled after Challenger, as the Department of Defense pulled out of the shuttle program effectively. So James Fletcher is actually nominated by President Nixon to be his choice of NASA administrator, and he's got a PhD in physics from Caltech. He's the only person this is Jim Fletcher, he's the only person to serve twice as NASA administrator, both 6 years from '71 to '77, but then also after Challenger, at a time when NASA doesn't have an administrator. Actually, the NASA administrator steps down in the month before the Challenger accident due to being indicted, James Beggs. I think he successfully beats that indictment, but nonetheless, as Challenger takes place, there is no NASA administrator, and Reagan makes the decision to reappoint Jim Fletcher to a second term, and Fletcher actually leads the return to flight after the Challenger accident. So OMB basically tells NASA in May of '71 that its budget will be flat over the next 5 years at only $3.2 billion. This limits the space shuttle development to no greater than $1 billion a year, about 1/3 of that total budget. This leads to the configuration of a partially reusable orbiter and sort of leads to the idea of an external liquid oxygen hydrogen tank that's made a couple of months later. And then the delta wing configuration is chosen in the fall of 1971. So back to the cost, I'm going to show you kind of this is one of the classic charts that NASA used at the time to kind of justify this option. This doesn't show well, but this is 10, 20, and 30 million. This is the launch cost per launch. And then these are 3 or 4 configurations of what NASA is considering with the development cost here at the bottom. One idea is to just use a Titan III and effectively a glider configuration, estimated to be a launch cost of 30 million, a 30,000 pound payload, a smaller payload bay, but only a development cost of about $3 billion. That is not widely considered, but the next 3 options are, and notice they all are in the range of 10 million or less. However, quite a wide range of development costs, from about 5 billion for this configuration, which is effectively what ends up getting selected, 8 billion for another configuration, and 10 billion for a 2-stage reusable configuration. So I mentioned the Mathematica study.
Can you go back to that for
Sure.
a second? So they've got 3 designs. I'd be curious first where just restarting Apollo would have put them.
Right.
But they've got 3 designs for effectively the same performance at radically different costs.
Yes.
Doesn't that imply that you've done a terrible job with your analysis? Because basically you're saying
Right.
the Pareto front is flat in this area.
Right. I mean, this is a good argument for the OMB to say, well, pick that one. Pick the one that's going to take us the least amount of
Also,
development.
if you've
'cause-
got 3 designs, one of them costs 5 times as much for no performance gain, that implies that there's something just very wrong with the analysis of all of them.
Right. I think that's correct, and I think your earlier point on the Saturn 1B and Saturn 5, to my knowledge, there's no real economic analysis to assess those situations. So you have those 2 launch vehicles. You have basically provably reliable systems that are in operation with existing facilities and infrastructure, and I've never seen a really good economic analysis that compares the cost of maintaining either the Saturn 1B or the Saturn 5. You know, that's effectively what the Russians did. The Russians kept a launcher that was used in the mid-50s all the way till today. It's had generational improvements, but it's largely the Soyuz R-7. What we've done now twice is throw out our launch capability for human spaceflight, and that's if you ignore Mercury and Gemini's launch configurations. Now, to be fair, the Saturn V production was shut down in August of '68. I mean, that's when the decision was actually made to not build additional Saturn Vs. But I think a serious analysis of the economics of the Saturn 1B in particular would have led you to the conclusion of just keep that as opposed to building an entirely new system. So now history is, you know, it's easy to look back with 20/20 hindsight on that. The Mathematica study is really the cornerstone of this argument, and it's based on 2 economists out of Princeton who basically justify the shuttle as being economically feasible, assuming the rate of manned space activity will not be less than it's been over the past 8 years. By the way, that's only an average of about 5 launches a year, roughly. I mean, when this study is done, under Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, Skylab, and Apollo Soyuz, there are 31 launches over 14 years. So 2 per year, but kind of even if you include just the 8 years before this study, it's only like about 4 or 5 per year. They actually select, or they recommend, a configuration which is called the thrust-assisted orbiter, which is effectively what we ended up with. And let me show you the demand analysis that they use. They actually base this on 514 space shuttle flights from 1979 to 1990. That becomes the baseline for both NASA and DoD that's used to justify the shuttle. This is the TAOS, the TAOS configuration, assumes a shuttle and a tug which could effectively take low Earth orbit payloads into GEO, and it estimates the total costs over that period at $35 billion, slightly less than $40 billion, which is defined as the new expendable capability, and not that much less than the 42 for the current expendables. These would be things like the Atlas, the Delta, and the Titan III.
Is there an explanation for the payload costs? Because
No, I'm not sure what that is. That's a good question.
Because like the total launch costs work out to basically the same for all of these options,
Right.
but they're basically saying that the overall program is way better for the shuttle because for some strange reason the payloads you put in the shuttle are going to radically get cheaper.
So a great master's thesis would be to take the Mathematica report, tear it apart, and analyze where it was right and where it was wrong, and maybe even try to do that comparison to the Saturn 1B. I think this was a very false sort of foundation to base the program on. It was skeptical at the time. In retrospect, it's even more dubious. But it was unbelievable the extent to which NASA advocated the shuttle based on the Mathematica report, particularly to Congress. Okay, so probably the most important decision takes place in August of '71, where Caspar Weinberger has now replaced George Shultz as the OMB director. By the way, Caspar Weinberger would go on to be the Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration. So both Shultz and Weinberger go into very prominent roles in that time frame. In fact, he's in the Pentagon when the STS-1 flies, and I was in a used bookstore a few years ago when, just after Caspar Weinberger died, and there was a very nice presentation piece that was made by John Young and Bob Crippen with an American flag from the STS-1 and a patch that was actually presented to Weinberger in that time frame after STS-1. Now that hangs in my study in my office, but and it's mostly because of this. I mean, I think most people looking at that would say, oh, it's just an interesting presentation piece. But in fact, 10 years earlier, I think the pivotal memo that's written to support the shuttle is this one by Cap Weinberger to the president. Not approving the shuttle would confirm a belief that our best years are behind us, that we are turning inward and voluntarily starting to give up our superpower status and our desire to maintain our world superiority. I mean, you could, by the way, you could transpose those words to the current discussion we just had yesterday on China and China space. I mean, this is largely what's driving the Chinese to conduct a manned space program right now. So in the margin, Richard Nixon writes, "I agree with Cap." So that becomes the memo on which the space shuttle program is effectively decided. However, it's not another 6 months before Nixon actually announces the decision. And what happens in that time frame is there's a lot of back and forth between the White House and NASA regarding how many jobs would be created from the shuttle program and in which states would those be created. Now, November of 1971 is a year before Nixon is up for re-election in November of '72. So NASA writes a memo that accelerating the start of the shuttle would lead to a direct employment of 8,800 people by the end of '72 and 24,000 by the end of '73 in pivotal states, Florida, Texas, and California, which are 3 states that Nixon needs to win in order to be reelected. NASA then releases study contracts called Phase B. They're initiated in November of '71. 4 contractors get $2.8 million, which is not a lot. They probably most heavily invested their own money on those teams. They basically evaluate 3 concepts. The Saturn V first stage is actually looked at as a flyback booster, a fully recoverable stage, which is really what NASA hopes to do, but becomes no longer feasible, and then the solid rocket motors. The solid rocket motors end up being chosen. It's determined that the Saturn I flyback is not desirable because it can't be reused. The development costs of this liquid propellant booster would be $4.2 billion, and the SRBs would be about $3.7 billion. So after this discussion between NASA and the White House, really largely based on job creation in January of '72, the first month of Nixon's re-election year. This is at San Clemente in California. Fletcher and Nixon with a model of the shuttle, basically approving the program and announcing a budget of $5.5 billion over an 8-year period to cover the spacecraft and the external tank and the SRBs. That's the lowest of the 3 options that were, basically presented by by NASA to the White House. Basically, Fletcher justifies that in terms of how it fits to the future of manned spaceflight. The shuttle becomes the primary program for NASA, and making space operations less complex and less costly becomes its primary selling point. The shuttle decision for the boosters is made 2 months later in March of '72 to use the SRBs. That actually forecasts a slightly lower development budget of $5.15 billion underneath the OMB targets. At this point, they delete the air-breathing engines for final approach and entry, and they have abort solid motors that separate the SRBs from the rest of the stack. In April, Rocketdyne is selected as the space shuttle main engine contractor. These study proposals are submitted by the 4 contractors in June of '72. Shortly thereafter, so these are effectively the proposals on which the down select is made. And in a relatively short period of time, only about 5 weeks later, North American Rockwell, which had built the Apollo command module and service module, is chosen to be the shuttle contractor with a $2.6 billion award. And then in August of '73, about a year later, Thiokol is picked to build the solid rocket boosters, and Michoud, which at that time was under Boeing's operational control, is picked to build the external tank. This is the winning concept. Looks a lot like what ended up becoming built as the shuttle. These were the key design trades, which is probably worth looking at. I think the selection of the payload weight of 65,000 pounds, the diameter of the payload bay at 15 feet, and the length at 60 feet become kind of critical. The cross-range performance, which I've talked about, which is really driven by these unrealistic DoD requirements. It's the choice of this thrust-assisted orbiter instead of a reusable first stage, elimination of the air-breathing engines, the choice of aluminum versus titanium. What's significant also is the elimination of a crew escape system. The first 4 flights of the shuttle do carry ejection seats on the orbiter's flight deck for the pilot and the co-pilot, but those are actually, they fly one mission with the ejection seats and a bigger crew, and then when Columbia is modified, they take the ejection seats out. That was STS 5, by the way. Yeah, 2 guys would have not made it, although most people think if you eject it out of the shuttle in ascent that there's a high likelihood the crew would end up in the plume, which would be tough to survive. And then the stacking architecture, if you really think about it, both accidents, Challenger and Columbia, are driven by the stacking architecture, making the shuttle vulnerable to either debris shedding in the case of Columbia or impingement of the SRB joint plume on the external tank in the case of Challenger, and the absence of a launch escape system is pivotal. So these are design trades that are made based on a reduced available budget. He was first to know.
Do you know why Duran went with the same cross-range requirement that the shuttle did?
No, but they actually proved it on their first flight. They landed at Baikonur on a single orbit unmanned flight successfully on the landing strip at Baikonur, something we've never done.
They have lots of land to land on, not necessarily
Right.
land in the ocean.
Right. Right. That's a good question. I'm not sure why. They copied a lot of things, and this one might have just been one.
They actually did do an analysis. I don't remember where I read this, but they didn't understand why we put such big wings on the thing. And then they actually did the analysis when they were building their own shuttle for how they should size it to give it maneuverability, and it turns out that is actually the optimal design if you want that degree of maneuverability. And I'm guessing that even Russia only covers half the planet, so if you want to get back from the other half of the planet, you still need a fair amount of maneuverability. I mean, if you think about it, the United States is pretty big too.
Did you?
Yeah, I was going to ask you to comment more on the stacking architecture, but you might have alluded to it in terms of just budget constraints.
Right.
Why they went with this particular stacking architecture.
I think well, that's a good question. I mean, it may have been other things than purely budget that resulted in that configuration. But had they adopted something more like a shuttle on top of a expendable launch vehicle, you would have eliminated the concerns about stacking. I mean, the real reason to insulate the external tank is to prevent ice damage from the external tank on the shuttle. If you've all seen pictures of the Saturn launches where ice was tolerated just falling off the sides of the launch vehicle. So the shuttle is built in the next basically 5 years. The goal of the 10 million, by the way, becomes 16 million. There's inflation in this time frame in 1976 dollars. All the expendable launch vehicles that the U.S. operates are to be retired. All of the U.S. government scientific and military satellites are to be launched by the shuttle. The two major technologies emerge of the main engine and the thermal protection system. Delays on both are really what pushes the first launch from 1978 to 1981. I think the significant thing to think about is after only 4 flights, the shuttle is declared operational, which is, just amazing when you compare it to any other operational air vehicle, either commercial aircraft or even military fighters. Now, keep in mind that the powered flight is really 8.5 minutes on ascent and 45 minutes to an hour on entry and landing. So after a grand total of less than 4 hours of elapsed operational time on 4 different flights, the space transportation system is declared operational far before. You could make a good argument that it was never operational. It was a development test vehicle all the way through its last flight on the 135th mission.
I want to refer to your third bullet from the last about the schedule slippage. Cost overruns. There was a lot of criticism of the shuttle program. We have a new president. Jimmy Carter's elected in 1976, not particularly known for his interest in space, although he was an engineer. And the story that I had heard is that he was ready to cancel it when the DoD went and said, look, Mr. President, without the space shuttle, you have no way of verifying the SALT II treaty. Mm-hmm. You'd have no other spy capability that will be believable, and that turned it around.
I think the DoD support for the shuttle was absolutely pivotal at that point, and not only that, but also the international support, having the European Space Agency and the Canadian Space Agency with important roles. Now, this was not done in the same way the International Space Station was done, where there's sort of a core dependency, but what they decided to do, and NASA felt that they could assign major roles to the Europeans and the Canadians without being sort of critical to the actual development of the shuttle. So the Canadians developed the Canada arm, and the Europeans developed Space Lab, and those are fundamental to, I think, continued support. So I think it's what you described, which is the DoD support, particularly on reconnaissance, but also European and Canadian involvement.
Did DoD actually ever put up any money for the development of the shuttle? Because I know they put a lot of requirements on it, and that they were supposed to provide money in the form of payloads later. But it seems like, if DoD was actually contracting anybody else besides NASA to build them a space vehicle, DoD would have to put up a whole hell of a lot more than either $0 or even the several billion that were actually spent on the shuttle.
Right. So there's no, to my knowledge, there's no direct transfer of DoD line item budget to NASA for the execution of the shuttle development program. But there's a lot of cooperation between Department of Defense and NASA, things like the Eastern Test Range, where NASA is effectively a tenant of the Air Force, not physically a tenant, but responsible, all the responsibility for the controlled airspace, for the launch safety of the range, and tracking and telemetry is carried out by the Air Force. So there's a lot of support, sort of, I would call it in-kind support. The Department of Defense takes on its own responsibilities, like the Vandenberg launch site, but I don't believe there's any direct transfer of budget authority from Department of Defense to NASA to fund the shuttle.
I will say, John, I was on a DoD committee looking at, this is some years later, looking at DoD uses of the International Space Station. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of people with blue suits and a lot of stars who were shaking their heads and saying, we were burned on the shuttle, we're not going to let it happen to us again.
Right. Well, and that becomes the case. I mean, basically the NRO, well, the Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office develop a series of primarily reconnaissance satellite KH-11s that basically need the size of the cargo bay of the shuttle to be launched. And if you look at sort of the post-Challenger recovery, the initial payloads that are flown are the highest priority Department of Defense payloads and the highest priority NASA payloads that are all designed based on the size and weight constraints of the payload bay of the shuttle. So there's an era between about 1986 through, let's say, 1992 where primary access to space is pretty much delayed for 28, 30 months by the return to flight, and then all of those payloads get launched in about a 5-year period.
I was just going to add, I've never seen it, but maybe you're aware of one. I would love to see a study comparing the amount of money that DoD put up for its expendable launch vehicles, either the old ones or the new ones,
Right.
versus the amount of money and in-kind support. You can add that in too. I would bet you for the shuttle, and I would bet you that basically they stiffed NASA on the shuttle. You know, they didn't help foot the bill. And
Well, you
if
can
NASA
ask.
had another
that's-
$5 billion to spend on the shuttle, maybe they wouldn't have had this problem.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you should ask that of Sheila Woodnall because she was the Secretary of the Air Force in 1994, I think, when that decision was actually made. And actually, she made the decision to do 2 versions of the EELV, the Atlas V and the Delta IV, which emerged. There was some debate about just doing one, and there was a decision made at the secretary level to actually do 2. I've never seen any analysis that sort of compares those, but she is actually the primary decision maker on that. So this compares those launch vehicles. So the Delta, the Atlas, and the Titan. This is an estimate, and this is in $1979. The Delta launch would be about $17 million, an Atlas 29, a Titan 53. The shuttle launches were estimated at $26 million, significantly greater payload, and if you divide those out, a much lower cost per pound. Also showing that, you know, our real capability to launch was, you know, this is in thousands of pounds to low Earth orbit. This is the start of the shuttle, so it increases from, you know, roughly 30,000 pounds to 65, and then with a trend that it could even get higher. So that works out to be about $56 million in FY 2000 dollars. And even in the best case estimate, where you do not include the development costs, the per unit flight costs of the shuttle in, you know, I would say in its latter years, where the budget was low at about $3 billion a year, and it was flying 5 or 6 missions a year, the actual cost per launch on a fully, you know, diluted basis, if you will, without any development costs was about 500. That's about the lowest number you can actually get behind in terms of what its true operational costs were. That's the first launch in '81. Now, the shuttle program did accomplish some very significant things, and I think I don't want to be too critical of either the decision or the accidents, but it was the first reusable spacecraft, the first to have wings, first to use a reusable thermal protection system, to fly with these state-of-the-art space shuttle main engines, which I think have the highest ISP of any liquid-propelled engine. Some people argue it's sort of the highest you're ever going to get with liquid-propelled rockets of about 420, 430 seconds, almost twice the specific impulse of what you can get with kerosene oxygen. The first winged vehicle to transition from orbital speed Mach 25 to hypersonic glide, and 2 accidents over 135 missions, so a loss rate of about 1 in 68. Wayne Hale and others compiled a great book on the history of the shuttle program, and this was one of the charts that he used to sort of show the mission complexity. Now, this is just kind of an arbitrary index, but as the program matured, the mission complexity got significantly higher with things like rendezvous and dockings on each flight, extravehicular activities. In terms of a destination, the shuttle was flown to Hubble 6 times, deployment of Hubble, and then 5 servicing missions and about 30 missions to the International Space Station. But in terms of the economics, this is if you take the entire cost of the shuttle program, and this is shown in 2010 dollars, the average cost per launch was about 1.5 billion, and we spent about 180 billion, more than what we spent on Apollo. So if you look at sort of Apollo in 1969 dollars was estimated at 24 billion. Now a lot of this is what do you use for inflation rates and how do you adjust? Do you use CPI? People argue that, but the number to compare $69 against today is about a factor of 5, maybe 6. So Apollo, over its entire program life, cost about 150 billion, maybe worst case. The shuttle, 180 billion. So I talked about what I think are kind of the three main issues that become players in both the accidents, the lack of a launch escape system, the horizontal stacking, and the use of the SRBs. Those compromises, contribute to both Challenger and Columbia. This is from the Columbia Accident Board investigation. The organizational causes of this accident are rooted in the program's history and culture, including the original compromises that were required to gain approval, which means basically both Congress and OMB and the White House. Subsequent years of resource constraints, fluctuating priorities, schedule pressures, and mischaracterization of the shuttle, of being operational rather than developmental, and lack of an agreed national vision for human spaceflight. By the way, that's an excellent report. I don't know, how many of you have actually read the Columbia Accident Investigation Report? I would highly recommend that if you want one report that encapsulates not only the sort of the technical issues that were faced in the accident investigation, but also the organizational and political issues that NASA faced across the scope of the program. It's really one of the best, and I'll get into that in more detail.
As an example of really good writing and tight reasoning,
Yep.
it just, since the Louisiana Purchase Declaration, I don't think there's been anything that good.
Right.
It's worth reading as an example of fine reporting.
Yeah, it should be made like a Course 16 requirement of, I don't know, I'll talk to you about that later, but and it's easy to read, and you'll enjoy reading it. It's actually quite interesting.
It has one line, which I think I'm quoting correctly, that it said NASA is an agency, something like paralyzed by its sense of invincibility.
I think that's a good point too. That particularly particularly in the era when the shuttle was designed, that there was this: we've been to the moon, we can do anything. That kind of leads to this hubris that affects the shuttle.
Sorry, can you go kind of more in depth into those three compromises? Like what about the horizontal stacking configuration made it such a big compromise? And the solid rocket boosters, are we just talking about how they had low ISP comparatively, or like what specifically made them bad?
Well, okay, that's a good question, and I'm going to defer a little bit of that because what I'd like to do in the next in the remainder of this is talk about the accidents, particularly the Columbia accident. But I hope by the end I will have answered. I mean, those become critical players in both Columbia and in Challenger. So back to how this was all decided. Well, I think NASA's willingness to accept the OMB driven limitations on the development are really what ultimately affects the shuttle reliability, and those are significantly outweighed by any apparent cost savings. And they become the causes of both the Challenger and the Columbia accidents. The DoD requirements creep was a significant factor, and you'll see this on almost every U.S. government program. But adding that cross-range requirement becomes a very significant factor. This mathematic analysis was inherently flawed with unrealistic assumptions, particularly relevant to the launch rate. So the fully capable Saturn 1B and Saturn Vs were basically abandoned with no comparative economic analysis. These unrealistic assessments of shuttle performance leading to the decision that it was operational after just 4 flights. I think that was part of sort of this organizational misleading that occurred. Now, there's a 40-year saga of shuttle without a destination, leading to the decision to build the International Space Station as the destination. And now we have the International Space Station as the destination without the shuttle as a means of getting there. So these are closely coupled programs. NASA's hoping to do both at the same time. They get spanned out over that almost 40-year period, 30 years of operational use of the shuttle from 1981 to 2011. Every major presidential decision, in my opinion, that was made about NASA since Apollo is about job creation, and it's made in the election year, in January of the election year, almost by coincidence. But Nixon makes the shuttle decision in January of '72. Reagan makes the station decision in January of '84, and Bush makes the Constellation decision and Vision for Space Exploration decision in January of 2004. There's one anomaly to that comparison. That's the George Herbert Walker's Bush announcement of the Mars program in July of 1989. But for the most part, NASA post-Apollo becomes creating jobs in key states which are pivotal to the election campaign of the president. And then I think an important one is NASA, like any other bureaucracy, begins to focus on self-preservation, that in order to continue spaceflight, it's often driven to accept these compromising positions in order to assure organizational survival. So it's a choice of, do you take what OMB is offering, the chance to do a space shuttle at the least favorable price for the least amount of budget, or do you not do a space shuttle? Well, they chose to do a space shuttle to keep the organization. Now, in the remaining time, I'm going to basically try to cover basically the Columbia accident in a little more detail and talk a little bit about some of the compromises that, primarily the organizational issues. I'll talk about the technology, but the organizational issues that transpired that affected both Columbia and Challenger. So a little bit of prior history. Well, Columbia on STS 93, which was the first mission commanded by a woman commander, Eileen Collins, really has probably the most significant launch incident in the history of the U.S. space program, at least after Challenger, that is carrying the Chandra X-ray Observatory, and 5 seconds after liftoff, there's an electrical short in the wiring, which causes a master alarm in the cockpit and causes the one of the two main electrical buses of the shuttle to basically be shut down, and the engine controllers on two of the three main engines change from the primary controller to the backup. So people in Houston, on the flight deck of the shuttle, and in Houston in mission control, they're seeing basically a major electrical problem 5 seconds after liftoff. What's not obvious is a second accident occurs, which is a injector plug in the space shuttle main engine's injector basically becomes loose and impinges on goes through the turbo machinery and impinges the engine nozzle inner liner and causes a hydrogen leak in the main engine nozzle. And so the people that are tracking the flight performance of the engine are noticing it's burning more hydrogen than expected, and it's having some limited off-nominal performance. And the shuttle engine is actually shut down early, but only by 0.7 seconds. Now that affects the delta V on orbit at 22 feet per second. So in that last few seconds when the shuttle is extremely light, it's accelerating at the fastest pace. They are able to conduct the mission and deploy the Chandra Observatory. The orbit falls about 30 miles short of the planned orbit. The mission is not compromised, but clearly this is a near miss in terms of these two incidences, both in the launch phase. And obviously, it's not the crew on board is not aware of that the space shuttle main engine is consuming more hydrogen, but in mission control they are. And now, for the remainder of the shuttle program, that that the actual flight control loops used that as a simulation because it was such a pressing problem. The first, and you know, the flight controllers have the first objective of trying to figure out, are these related? Is the electrical failure and the propellant leak related in any way? It turns out they were completely unrelated, but occurred at almost the same time and affected the entire ascent. So Columbia goes into an orbiter maintenance down period, and 4,900 wiring nonconformities were discovered. Because they had the short on STS-93, they opened up all of the wiring and identified, you know, serious wiring issues. And by the way, that main engine leak was caused by poorly routed wiring, which had been rubbed by an exposed screw during its use. Now they execute after the orbiter maintenance period. They do a perfect flight. STS-109 was one of the Hubble servicing missions. There are no issues. This mission, STS-107, is scheduled for July of 2002, but then Space Shuttle main engine flow liner cracks are identified, and that creates a several-month delay period. 2 flights before the Columbia accident, STS-112, sustained major bipod foam damage, in this case to the SRB. At the flight readiness review of the next mission, STS-113, that's not even, that's resolved but not called an anomaly. And at the flight readiness review for STS-107, the bipod foam loss is not even discussed. So, and by the way, the shuttle at this point is flying with a serious number of waivers on the order of, I've seen estimates anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 waivers, safety waivers prior to the Columbia STS-107 launch. This is the mission. I actually took this picture with a remote camera.
Who has waiver authority?
Ultimately, the mission management team, and the flight readiness review is basically conducted by the mission management team.
Who is the mission management team?
In this case, the chair was Linda Ham. It's representatives of NASA engineering and flight directors, and they basically meet prior to the launch. They meet during the mission, typically daily. And I'll get into that in a little bit of detail if we have time. I was just going to point out that this is a mission which was really added to the manifest by Congress. Due to delays in the space station, the Congress decides they need another microgravity research mission. So the mission is manifested really by congressional direction. It becomes kind of a political football. President Clinton rewards Israel with putting an Israeli astronaut on the flight. By the way, he was a hero of Israel who had been involved in in conducting the raid on the very accomplished test pilot, Ramon. And Vice President Gore, right at MIT here, announced GoreSat, which was a satellite to look at the Earth and provide what was then called a web browser, so that you can open the web and look at the Earth from space. It was originally manifested to 107. It was actually built. It's in a clean room at Goddard Space Flight Center. There's some talk about still launching it. It's never been launched, but for a while it was the main payload of STS-107. Because of the Israeli astronaut involvement and a primary experiment, they decided to launch into a 39-degree orbit. So the space station is in a 57-degree orbit, but the decision is made to launch Columbia into a 39-degree orbit. It does carry the extended duration orbiter capability, and 4 rookies are assigned to the mission. This is the launch. I was actually on the top of the VAB that day. Beautiful launch, but just seconds later the foam strike occurs, and you've probably all seen the. Let's see if I can start that. That's the foam hitting the hitting the left wing of the orbiter. Just do that again. Now, one of the problems is the cameras that are used are actually the primary view of the left wing from the ground cameras is actually out of focus. So the best view that the ground cameras have of the left wing are out of focus. And as they got into looking at all the cameras that were around the launch facility, basically it was found that these were installed during Apollo. They were all film cameras. They were, in most cases now, 25, 30 years old. One of the things that was done post-Columbia was to upgrade all of those cameras. But basically, as you probably know, the bipod strut foam, which is shown here, which weighs about 2 pounds, struck the orbiter, and the differential rate at which the foam is decelerated resulted in an impact that is equivalent to about 500 miles per hour. And if you sort of do the math, one of the things I did to try to put this in comparison, if you hold a bowling ball at about 10 feet, it has roughly the same kinetic energy when it impacts the ground as a 2-pound piece of foam at 500 miles per hour. And it's impacting the leading edge, which is brittle carbon-carbon. Now, that was perceived to not be let's see if I could. Okay, that was perceived to not be an issue, and this is probably one of the only times the crew was made aware of the foam strike. So this is a memo from the flight director in Houston to the commander and the pilot, sent up to the orbiter. This is already a week after the launch. The launch occurred on January 16, and basically what they're doing is prompting the commander and the pilot to be prepared for the next day's PAO event with the press, expecting that there may be a question that comes up regarding the foam impact. During ascent, there's a crew news conference. There's one held on each mission. So this is a memo preparing the crew for a question that they're likely to get asked in the crew news conference about the foam strike. During ascent at approximately 80 seconds, photo analysis shows that some debris impacted the wing. The impact appears to be totally on the lower surface. We've seen this same phenomenon on several other flights, and there's absolutely no concern for entry. Now, what's significant is the crew can't see the leading edge of the orbiter out of the payload, out of the flight deck or the mid-deck of the shuttle. And this, because the shuttle is not doing a rendezvous mission, it does not have the canid arm, so there is no way to inspect the orbiter leading edge without an EVA. And the decision was made not to do that EVA. You've probably all seen, let's see if I can get this to work. This is the breakup of the shuttle over Texas. I was watching this live. I was not in at the launch site, but I was watching NASA TV live, and then I turned on CNN after it was, minutes after that. CNN was reporting, and the first news on the shuttle, I'll always remember this, shuttle breaks up at 200,000 miles above Earth instead of 200,000 feet above Earth, and at 18 times the speed of light instead of 18 times the speed of sound. So now they had the number right, but not the units. So the formation of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board actually is done the next day under a contingency plan that's developed by after Challenger, and it primarily consists of military people, but it's chaired by Harold Gaiman, who did an amazing job, I think, leading this investigation. His prior investigation was the USS Cole accident. When this board was formulated, I was kind of skeptical on game, and I did not know him, but I was kind of skeptical on a Navy admiral leading a space shuttle investigation, but he did a superb job. And then they added key civilians about 2 weeks later to assure that the committee was independent and not biased. That's Sheila Woodnall, John Logsdon, Sally Ride. This gentleman I forget, but he works at the Volpe Transportation Center. This is Scott Hubbard, who went on to be the head of Ames Research Center. So it's an excellent panel, and with people like John Logsdon on the panel, they really studied some of the organizational issues that led to the accident. The focus is on the external bipod ramp. And by the way, the external bipod ramp came off the external tank on 6 prior shuttle missions. So this was the 7th shuttle mission where this same piece of foam came off the external tank. And that was in daylight launches where it could be observed photographically. If you extrapolate to the number of night launches, it's likely this was the 12th time at that rate. It would have been 12 times. So 1 in 10 times during launch, the shuttle bipod foam comes off. Now it's just a question of at what point in the ascent. I mean, most of these things are going to happen around max Q, which is when this happened at 81 seconds. But at various points, that trajectory has a different shape, obviously. This is what the trajectory analysis showed, that there was a high probability that the foam, this is the leading edge, so there's a high probability that the foam impacted either panel 7 or panel 8 at a velocity of about 500 miles an hour, 775 plus feet per second, and weighing at about 2 pounds. A lot of issues brought up, a lot of the discussion in the investigation board brought up the decision-making process at NASA, both the history of foam anomalies. The shedding causes for the foam were not understood. There's some complex cryopumping that occurs when the tank is cooled down to cryogenic temperatures for the oxygen and hydrogen to be loaded. And due to the humidity in Florida, you get basically a cryopumping action that brings the humidity of the atmosphere into the foam on the shuttle. But foam shedding had become a normal expectation. In fact, foam shedding occurred on every flight, and almost on every flight the thermal protection system was damaged. There was also schedule pressure. Everyone at NASA had a screensaver which showed the countdown to the completion of ISS U.S. core complete date of February 19 of 2004, the following year. There was this whole series of these memos, the emails that were uncovered as far as, the perception of the resistance of the resilience of the reinforced carbon-carbon. It didn't look like a big enough piece to pose any serious threat to the system. I mean, this is an engineering memo, and there's not a single number in this memo. There's really no equations. There's no numerical analysis. This is almost this is an opinion being stated, which basically says that not only does it say that there's not a likelihood of damage, which is what this paragraph says. It basically says here that even if there is damage, that the vehicle could survive that. The impact data says the structure will get slightly hotter, but would still be okay. Again, no numbers, no serious engineering behind an opinion stated. And there's a number of these. The debris management team, which is actually at Kennedy, and they're not directly involved. They're not directly under either the mission management team or the mission evaluation room. That team and others wanted to conduct on-orbit photography of the shuttle using U.S. Department of Defense assets, both ground-based and satellites. Now, this was kind of, because of the changes that were occurring at NASA, one of the most experienced flight directors and chair of the mission management team on several occasions, many flights, was Wayne Hale. He had just been assigned a new position as manager of Shuttle launch integration at Kennedy Space Center. So he had already relocated to Kennedy Space Center. This group that did the debris assessment, the photography analysis of the launch, actually reported to Wayne Hale. And Wayne Hale made the request and started talking to the Department of Defense about using those assets to image the shuttle. Because this was a low priority mission, one of his proteges, I think you'd call it, Linda Ham, was put in charge of the mission management team. So this was her first mission as head of the mission management team. This is a memo, let's see, SSP, I'm drawing a blank on what that acronym, but SSP, Space Shuttle Program Office, was asked directly if they had any interest, desire in requesting resources outside of NASA to view the orbiter, i.e. the wing leading edge debris concern. They said no. After talking with Phil, this is a memo from Leroy Kane, who's the lead flight director. He's the guy in that video that I showed you. And Phil Engeloff, I believe, is the Space Shuttle Program Manager at the time. So another time when the request to basically conduct imagery of the shuttle is denied. So there were 3 different requests for imagery that were basically made at various points, both at Kennedy and at Johnson. There were additional discussions. You can see that Wayne Hale directly funded the Department of Defense, but then was stopped by Linda Ham, the head of MMT. This is really yet another missed opportunity that occurred. There's telemetry received prior to loss of signal that shows several of the sensors in the wing's left-hand side that go off nominal or go offline completely. So these blue sensors are completely offline, and it's sort of evidence that there's tremendous damage taking place inside the wing, primarily to the wiring harnesses. That LOS occurs just before 9 o'clock, so 30 seconds before 9 o'clock. The actual breakup occurs about 40 seconds later. And what's very interesting is this happens to be the first shuttle. It carries a full flight instrumentation system that was never taken out of the orbiter, that has 800 sensors measuring temperatures, pressures, on an archaic 1-inch thick magnetic tape that no one thought would survive the reentry. And in fact, it did survive, and it was found, and that OEX recorder becomes one of the pivotal sources of data on the breakup of the shuttle. That's the debris footprint over Texas. This results in a massive engagement led by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, to basically recover the debris, make sure no one is injured. They actually lose a helicopter in the process, and 2 or 3 pilots. This is the debris reconstruction. Notice quite a bit of the right wing is recovered, much less of the left wing. This is the aerodynamic performance. The red line is STS 109, which was a prior mission of Columbia. So you can see that it's basically this is the roll moment, and this is the yaw moment. So in the red line, you're seeing sort of the standard performance where even with an oscillation, it's recovering. The control system is returning it to the nominal position. Early in the entry over the Pacific Ocean, you start to get this off-nominal performance. There's a flash observed over California, and It's the first piece to basically come off the shuttle. There are actually video observers in California that are seeing this. By the way, not many of the trajectories to return to Kennedy Space Center are in this descending node coming over the continental United States. In fact, I think the next, had they missed this landing opportunity, the next landing would have been from the south over Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico, and most of the recovered fragments would have been lost. So, you know, this is in blue is the STS-107 aero data showing that it's basically fighting this large off-nominal roll and then what becomes a large off-nominal yaw in this time frame, and basically loss of control here. By the way, that's a photo taken at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque of the shuttle on entry, and this is the left wing, and this distortion here is evidence that there's an aero performance affecting both, and you could see what looks like debris or some type of venting coming off the back. So as I said, finding that OEX flight recorder was absolutely very significant to this investigation because it filled 30 seconds of loss between the loss of telemetry and the final breakup of the orbiter. That's the part. What survived this reentry was amazing in terms of, you know, the objects that were dense and heavy, like aluminum. Almost none of the aluminum made it back to the ground. Most of the aluminum was oxidized during the entry. The only traces of aluminum that were recovered were residue of aluminum on the heat shields and the tiles. However, patches and flags made it to the ground, and this OEX data recorder made it to the ground, and it was useful in the investigation. This shows the scale in temperature, comparing STS-107 in red against 3 other shuttle entries. This shows sort of the emergent model of how the superheated flow of gas entered the wing at RCC number 8 and came through the primary wing box. This is where the carbon-carbon was recovered. So initially the pieces of eroded carbon-carbon are found, then the left wing breakup, and then the right wing breakup. So a model is created that, you know, effectively shows these were recovered pieces, and this is likely where the breach occurred. You know, one of the things that all of these investigations do is piece together a second-by-second analysis of the timeline of what happens, and this is a shortened version of that, but if you go into the report, you'll see that explained at length. So several things are going on in parallel. There's an analysis of the foam, there's analysis of the RCC. The decision was made to actually reconstruct the RCC in a model using actual hardware from from Discovery and Endeavour at the Kennedy Space Center, and they needed a wing substrate to bolt it to, and they actually took that off the Enterprise at the Air and Space Museum and rebuilt the leading edge of the wing and impacted it with foam, and I'll show that to you in a minute. So the thermal analysis is done using CFD. This is actually the CFD analysis that shows the breach, and the concludes that temperatures exceeded about 5,000 degrees. Now this is probably one of the most interesting things. On the second day of the flight, an object emerges from the wing of the shuttle. Now it could have emerged from the payload bay as well, but it's tracked based on Stratcom assets, which track the U.S. Through these ultra-high frequency radars. One of those radars is at Cape Cod at Otis Air Force Base, and another one's at Beale. These are the PAVE-PAW radars, and basically they detect this object, which separates from Columbia on the second day, January 17, and it's actually seen in about 3 or 4 orbital passes on the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, and it's believed to have re-entered on January 20. From this data, they reconstructed the orbital elements of that object, including its mass, and then they determined, based on the radars, they determined the radar cross-section at this frequency, which is the UHF frequency. That's the radar cross-section of the piece. And based on the analysis of the orbit and understanding its mass, they determined that it had a ballistic coefficient of 0.1 meters squared per kilogram. And these are, reasonably accurate predictions. This is plus or minus 15%. This analysis was backed up by work done at Lincoln Laboratory, and then at AFRL, which has a Air Force Research Lab in Dayton, Ohio, which has a radar range. 31 candidate materials that could have come off the shuttle from the payload bay or the wings were actually analyzed. And of those 31 pieces, only the fragment of wing leading edge, RCC, matched both the UHF radar cross-section signature and the ballistic coefficient.
Do you have any indication of when this analysis was done?
This was done early on in the investigation, probably in the February-March timeframe. NASA had no idea this flight day object was released, though. I mean, it really wasn't until the request was made after the accident to Stratcom to analyze the data that they had historically stored. So it was none of this was known during the mission itself. But it was a direct match, and it predicted a piece of carbon-carbon at about 140 square inches, so like 12 by 12. You probably have seen this test, but if I could get it to run here, it's worth. This is the, well, maybe not. There it is. This is the impact of the foam. This is the test at Southwest Research Institute. That's the outside. That's the hole that it created. Let's see if I could show this one on the inside. There it is. Thank you. That's the inside of the leading edge. Thank you. So that's the impact. Almost certainly the Flight Day 2 object matches that cross-section of the carbon-carbon. I only have a few minutes, and I really wanted to kind of focus on the organizational issues. I mean, this really became a discussion of the organization. The technical understandings of the cause of the accident were very well identified. But what really became, the serious debate became what were the significant issues from a managerial standpoint and from an organizational culture. So 87 missions were flown between Columbia and Challenger, but the shuttle program was operating extremely close to many margins. The shuttle budget and workforce were decreased by 40%. This shows the shuttle program budget from 1991 to basically to 2003, with the projection for the next 5 years in the budget. And there were several studies that were done, and I'll get into one effectively in 1996, led by Chris Kraft, who's really one of the most significant figures in human spaceflight. At that time, he was retired and led this report assessing the shuttle program. But little margin for addressing unexpected technical problems or to make upgrades. And in that report, in 1995, the shuttle is mischaracterized as a mature and reliable system. NASA continued to outsource many of the responsibilities for managing the shuttle. There are warnings of a shuttle accident. Some of these are kind of eerie. This is an OTA, Office of Technology Assessment study in 1989. The probability of maintaining at least 3 orbiters in the shuttle fleet declines to less than 50% after Flight 113. The accident occurred on Flight 113. It's almost eerie that they picked that number. The Augustine Commission basically echoes that. This would seem to be the weak link of the civil program, unpleasant to recognize, involving all the uncertainties of statistics and difficult to resolve. The Kraft report, declared that the shuttle was a mature and reliable system. This is after about, I would say, 80 flights roughly in that time frame, maybe 70. Now, to its credit, the NASA Aerospace Safety Advisory Board challenged that. I mean, they basically said the assumption that the Kraft report makes and shuttle systems are now mature smacks of a complacency which may lead to serious mishaps. Fact is, the shuttle may never be mature enough to totally freeze the design. Another thing that's happening is the shuttle retirement date keeps getting extended. First it's thought to be 2006, then 2012. When Columbia actually flies, the retirement date has been pushed out to 2020. Some people compare it to the B-52, that it can continue to fly for many years. There are fluctuating attitudes on investing in upgrades and infrastructure. There are actually some attempts made to upgrade the launch control system, to upgrade the APUs and go from nitrogen tetroxide, hydrogen and nitrogen tetroxide to an electrical system. And they actually spend, on those upgrades, they spend about $300 million, and actually both of those are abandoned. Hydrazine, by the way, thinking of. But what really happens is this NASA human safety culture, which, after Apollo views NASA as the perfect place, and there's resistance to external suggestions for change, flawed decision-making, self-deception, introversion, and a diminished curiosity about the system. It turns out that there were foam impacts on every space shuttle launch, and again, the biped foam came off on 6 prior missions observed and an estimated 12 total. These were the major foam strikes, and just 4 months before the Columbia accident on STS-12, the bipod foam ramp came off that mission. The external tank project was assigned an action, but it was not closed out until after 113 and 107. So in other words, they flew with that known deficiency. Sally Ride was on both accident investigation boards, Challenger and Columbia. She coined this term echoes of Challenger, and what really came up was the discussion on something called normalization of deviance. A Boston College professor of sociology named Diane Vaughan wrote a book called The Challenger Launch Decision, and she basically studied the organization and what led to the Challenger Launch Decision. She coined the term normalization of deviance. Effectively, well-intentioned people and organizations can become desensitized to deviations. Unexpected becomes the expected, becomes the accepted. The machine was talking, no one was listening. So fundamentally, in both accidents, off-nominal performance data was being expected as the norm, being tolerated and then expected. On the Challenger accident, this was the temperature ranges at launch. Challenger was the 25th mission, so there are 24 data sets prior to Challenger. There were 3 incidences of burn-through on STS-51C, which was launched at a temperature of about 53 degrees. Now in this range, all of these missions were flown at relative high temperatures at Kennedy Space Center, and there was no burn-through. These missions had 1 incident of burn-through. This was sort of an outlier at a relatively high temperature, 75, that had 2. but the launch on Challenger occurred here. Basically, as this data was being gathered, the feeling was the system survived launch and it could tolerate this kind of burn through. And effectively, the same thing happened on the ascent foam strikes to the orbiter. Both accidents were a failure of foresight, where engineers and managers continually normalized these technical deviations. There was a wide range of sort of what I would call policy compromises that created systems effects at the time of Columbia that were very similar to what existed prior to Challenger. There was schedule pressure. They continued to fly with the flaws when these problems were defined. And NASA continued to sort of be immersed in this culture of invincibility. We probably are running out of time, and I don't know if we'll have time next week to talk about any of these, but you know, what's amazing to me is
We can decide to pick this up on Tuesday.
Okay.
I'll kind of show it.
I think what's amazing here, and if you do have a chance between now and then, I would strongly recommend looking at the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report, because they're the same issues that you're all going to face in engineering careers, whether you work on a commercial airliner or if you work in the space program. It's a great study of the challenges that organizations face, bureaucracies face, and sort of how engineers, particularly I would say the working level engineers, are accepted and treated in these organizations. There's some great postings recently by Wayne Hale, who has a blog, who basically wrote many really interesting assessments 10 years after Columbia on sort of that culture at NASA. And if we have time next week, I'll go into those in a little more detail.
Thank you very much.